electric driving is actually now quite beneficial compared to ICE if you do the math. And again, this index thing is not a invention as such, but it clearly illustrates the point.
Yeah.
And you get 2 to 3 to 4 times the range if you actually choose to charge at home compared to if you choose the old style with petrol or diesel. And I think it's quite interesting that debate which is going on in Europe. There are a lot of uneducated guesses or biased people who are used to driving the old petrol cars. And we see that Europe is moving on the S-curve, and the EV sales in Europe in the big markets are now starting to move big time.
All right. Eirik, Power to Drive, how are you? We're back again, 2026. How is it to be back in Munich?
It's super warm to start like that. It's 30 plus outside and feels like it's 30 plus inside. A lot of people.
Yes.
A lot of good conversations though.
Yes. It feels like every year it's getting bigger, more intense, more warm. So as well. But it's also been an exciting day for us. We've launched something called the Zaptec Index today. So it was your idea.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit on how this came about.
Yeah, I can try. So I'm not that creative, but yeah, you're right. It was actually my idea. It was around the Q1 presentation. We sort of started looking into, okay, how can we try to tell a story to the market that electric driving is actually now quite beneficial compared to ICE if you do the math. And then we have a fantastic marketing team who did some magic, put me on the spot to make a little video, but that's not the point. The point is that we have created a tool which is open, based on open sources, which can compare how far you get for your money. And I think it's quite interesting that debate which is going on in Europe. There are a lot of uneducated guesses or biased people who are used to driving the old petrol cars.
Is that something you also notice still in the Nordics specifically, or do you see it as a European problem outside of the biggest EV regions?
I think it's a maturity thing, and you see it less and less in Norway, even though you will always have these petrol heads who go back and say, don't drive electric.
Yeah.
But I think totally unrelated to range and stuff like that, but you have some silly arguments, which you also had in Norway in the beginning, like, you drive an EV, it's tearing up the roads more than a normal car.
The weight or...
I mean, it's BS basically. Yeah. But I saw this in Norway, and then Norway came, as many people know, very fast, went from almost no electric sales to now being dominated by EVs. Yeah. 98-ish, 99% of sales are electric. And then as market matured and people started driving electric, they understood, okay, range anxiety is not really a problem. The cars are not destroying the roads more than the petrol vehicles. So I think it's a maturity thing. And in the UK, interestingly enough, we did pick up some of this in the news that EVs are tearing up the roads.
Yeah.
So I think it's a maturity thing. And now we're here in Germany, driving into this fair. Of course, you don't see EVs.
No.
So I think you can look at that in two ways. The Germans are laggards, and maybe they are, but the future looks good for us who build infrastructure and to support the transition.
I think it's interesting when you look at the Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish market. I think let's say the enabler, the installer, the CPOs, is usually, for me, my experience was always they want a straightforward solution. They want to see what saves time, what is the quickest to install ultimately, what's good to commission, where is the quality and the support up to par with what they expect. Here, sometimes the discussions we have is a lot of holding on to old standards and legacies because it's what they're used to and what they know.
Yeah.
So when you speak about history repeating itself from Norway to Europe, what do you think is that key moment where it accelerates? You mentioned before, it used to be, you drive an EV in Norway. What is the moment where you think we move away from that and where the majority sees it as an opportunity for themselves?
Yeah. I think it's quite simple. I think it's economics. That was also what happened in Norway. Norway was the front runner because of incentives. Okay, Norway is a rich nation. We could afford to have incentives. There were no VAT, meaning there are a lot of taxes in Norway. Yeah. No VAT, so you could basically get a supercar for half the price of what was used to be a normal car, and that took the question out of the table. You buy the electric; it's the obvious choice.
Yeah.
And then as time moved, the range got better, the cars got cheaper, and the incentives were scaled back, but still it's the no-brainer choice.
Yeah.
And I think that is the key point also what we try to illustrate with the Zaptec Index.
Yeah.
If you look in Europe, it is now more affordable to buy and own an EV, and it's far more affordable to drive an EV.
Yes.
And I think ultimately, for most people, the car is just an unnecessary thing in your home budget. It's costly, but you need it.
Yeah. I think when we look at something like the index where it's about how far can 10 euros get you?
Yeah.
Which is a very straightforward look, which is important because the one thing we have in Germany is range anxiety. The average consumer still looks at it as, oh, but what if I have to go further to do a weekend trip with my friends? And we have data that, says on average 22 kilometers is the daily commute for someone.
Yeah.
But there's always the fear, what if I have that trip to go from Munich to Berlin? And sure, if you're in sales and you travel a lot, that's usually, I take that statement. And I think the charging network and public charging has become better. But we see development. And I think over the past few years, we've seen some countries going up in EV sales, some stabilizing, some also have been reducing previously. But I think this year so far, it's a very clear picture across Europe. So from your perspective, as a number data-driven guy, what do you see in the data for this year and so far?
No, I see exactly as you say. I see an acceleration. Yeah. And again, I'm an economist. I'm a financial dude. Of course, I look into the data. Again, I think it's about the math. When you had, and we've said it for many years, that new affordable EVs were coming. Longer range, cheaper cars. Yeah. That's happening. At the same time, we had the Iran crisis. Yeah. The petrol and diesel prices have been skyrocketing. Yeah. And people have actually started to look into what is this mean? Yeah. What does this mean for me as a consumer? Yeah. And again, this index thing is not a invention as such, but it clearly illustrates the point. Yeah. And you get 2 to 3 to 4 times the range if you actually choose to charge at home compared to if you choose the old style with petrol or diesel. So I think looking into the data, we see that the transition to a new technology often follows an S pattern. And we see that Europe is moving on the S curve. Yeah. And the EV sales in Europe, in the big markets, are now starting to move big time. And battery electric vehicles sales in May this year was up 40% in Europe compared to last year. Wow. So it's more than even though inflation is high, 40% is quite a lot. Yeah. And we think it's still early because only 5% of the fleet in Europe is electric. And you have the incentives coming and you have the EU regulations who will push the fleet over to electric. And the target for the European Union is to have EVs and not to have ICE. Yeah. So we think this is actually the beginning of the mass adoption.
Well, you just mentioned 40%. Is that, from your knowledge now, is that because some countries specifically stick out or because the average is, let's say, on a similar path, or is it really some countries are a bit behind, some are accelerating way more than others?
We see, of course, not the exact same figure in every country, and some of the Nordic countries are in sort of 13, 14, 15% growth, but some are growing extremely fast. I think France is an example where it's been extremely high growth, at least May compared to May. Yeah. But overall, we see that the big markets are moving double digit and 30, 40, 50% compared to last year. So it is a trend shift. It was growing last year, but this year it's shifting.
Yeah. But one last question I do have as the numbers guy and looking at the landscape, how we're developing across regions outside the Nordics as well. How do you feel looking at Zaptec in Europe now versus 2-3 years ago? Especially when you look at those big countries we spoke about, France, Germany. Of course, yes, you're going to say potential, and of course that's true. But do you see, looking around now, have you changed, let's say, your view on Europe as a market ever since we started going into these markets, having market compliant products? Is there something you learned or you were surprised about in this journey on getting here?
I think we could probably have another podcast on this topic, but
coming soon.
We've learned a lot. Some the hard way, and some the good way, I guess. We have to acknowledge that we were a small company from Norway, tried to conquer Europe, and that's a quite ambitious plan.
It is.
We've made some mistakes, that's fine, but we're learning, and I think now we are in a position where we see some fruits of the hard work. We have some signs. I know you have some of your back pocket,
Yeah.
which is very, very interesting. And I think, yeah, to look back in the mirror and say we should have done this and that is sort of, it doesn't give you much. I think you can only learn from the mistakes and look forward. And I think it's still the right thing to do to focus on the big markets, because the markets are so big.
Yeah.
And it's so early in the transition. So I'm quite sure we have a role to play also in large markets where as we've demonstrated in small and medium-sized markets in Europe.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. Looking forward to the rest of Power to Drive with you.
Same
And
to you.
hopefully some more air conditioning. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's super hot.
Thanks.